Good morning, everyone, and welcome to DigiShift 70. It's great to see you all this morning. On today's call, we're going to be taking a deeper look at AI. So it's been a really popular topic right through this year, and we've already had a brief chat about it in April. But today we're delighted to have two expert speakers. We've got Steph Wright from the Scottish AI Alliance, which is a network which works to support responsible, safe and trustworthy AI, and she'll speak a bit more about the work that they're doing in a moment. We've also got Gina Helfrich from the Edinburgh Futures Institute, which is part of Edinburgh University, and that's an organisation which works to bring together technical knowledge and moral knowledge so that we can develop AI and technology safely. And again, that's a brief introduction, and I'm sure that Gina will talk a bit more about the work that they do in a moment. So I can see people saying hello in chat, which is great. And so what we're going to do is we'll kick off with Steph and her introduction, then we'll go straight to Gina, but ask questions as we go along. So if something occurs to you when you're hearing from either Steph or Gina, just fire it into chat and we'll keep an eye on it and we'll bring it up in the Q&A time. And I guess the other thing I want to say is, there's no question off limits today. This is a new area. There's lots of interesting questions. We're going to try and keep it focused on AI and trustworthy and responsible use of AI, because that's really our focus. But if you've got questions or queries, pop them into chat and we'll do our best to get to them in the time we've got available. So without further ado, I'll say thank you to Steph and Gina and pass across to Steph to get going.
Hello, good morning, everybody. As John said, I'm Steph Wright, and I'm the head of the Scottish AI Alliance. So I'm gonna talk a bit today about AI, as you're all expecting, and then I'll pass over to Gina, who'll talk very specifically around some AI technologies. But as you all know, AI is very dominant in the media at the moment. So I just wanted to give you a bit of an overview and maybe address some of the kind of main concerns around AI at the moment. So let me share my screen and hopefully that all works perfectly fine. So give me 1 second. So can you see that okay, everybody? Can someone? Yep, fantastic, brilliant. This is always the bit where you share a screen and then everyone disappears and you're like, ah. Anyway, so I'm going to talk about AI separating fact from fiction. But first, I'm going to kick off with a little bit of an overview. So, what is AI? Well, AI, or artificial intelligence, is not new. It can trace its origins back to the early days of modern computing when the term was first coined in the 1950s. So definitely not new. But, while descriptions abound, I'm going to tell you a bit more about a course we've developed, but like we asked 26 experts, what is AI? And every single person gave a different answer. So, but, we in Scotland's AI strategy, we use this specific definition, which is technologies used to allow computers to perform tasks that would otherwise require human intelligence, such as visual perception, speech recognition, and language translation. But ultimately, it's a really broad discipline. Think of it as a group of complementary technologies. So when people say an AI, it's kind of not quite right, because AI it's various things. So it can include data-driven techniques, which are all evolving constantly. So well, what's Scotland's AI strategy? I hear you ask. Well, I hope you don't ask, actually. I hope you have a vague awareness of it. We try very hard to make sure people know it's there. But it was launched in March 2021, and it lays out the vision for Scotland to become a leader in the development of trustworthy, ethical, and inclusive AI. And these three values is what informs everything that we do. So the Scottish AI Alliance, we're the body tasked with delivering on this vision, and it's a partnership between the Data Lab and the Scottish Government. So that's just a wee intro to us. But what I want to talk about here today, there's many things we can talk around AI, but I kind of want to talk a bit about the hype around AI at the moment. So let's separate some facts from fiction. This is something we're really passionate about doing at the AI Alliance. So first thing I want to talk about, AGI, artificial general intelligence. This is the type of thing you see in sci-fi movies, Skynet, Matrix, when computers become sentient and take over the world. I want to stress that this currently does not exist, and experts debate whether it actually ever will. So put that to rest, hopefully. And then next, extinction risk. That's something that has dominated the headlines over the last couple of months because of a letter written by lots of godfathers of AI, no godmothers, just a note, but saying that essentially, there's an existential risk from AI. And one thing we want to address around this, and then obviously, the papers and everything all run with that. Oh my God, AI is going to kill us all. But really, the thing is, we have more immediate risks about AI to be concerned around, and also bigger risks that are not necessarily AI, like climate change, but are specific to AI, bias, misinformation, etc. These are things that actually exist now and are happening right now. And there we are focusing on something that might never happen, that doesn't exist yet. Especially climate change right now, Southern Europe's on fire, bits of Canada are on fire, and other parts of the world underwater. There seems to be no, incentive to be worried about that compared to, worried about a science fiction scenario of, AI taking over the world. But that's my view. But anyway, it's the technology's fault. That's the other thing, narrative that's kind of out there at the moment. And we find this quite frustrating because, the doomsday narratives, it kind of like distracts from the important conversations that need to be had around holding the individuals and organizations behind the technology to account. As I said at the start, AGI does not exist. These technologies are not sentient. They're not doing stuff on their own. There are people behind this. So we need to hold them to account to ensure that these technologies are developed and deployed in a responsible way. Sorry, I'm kind of running through here. I think the best bit of all these kind of sessions is the Q&A. But anyway, next thing, AI is coming for my job. That's also a massive narrative at the moment. And, whilst implementation of AI will lead to job losses, as any technological advance has throughout history, it will also create a plethora of new jobs. Something we joke about, 6 months ago, there was no such thing as a, generative AI prompt engineer. And now there are lots of those roles. And the truth is, we have no idea what the jobs of 5 years, 10 years, 15 years will look like. So there is that. We're not going to shy away from the fact that jobs will be lost. I think it's disingenuous of anyone to say that it won't be. But jobs will change. The job market will change. But also, I wanted to say is that, remember, it's not the AI that is coming for your job, because behind the AI are organizations and people behind the decisions. So getting there, last one. AI is a magic bullet. There's a lot of FOMO from organizations at the moment around AI. Oh my God, we need to use AI. It'll make everything better. But it's important to recognize that it's not a magic solution to every business. It's not the solution to everything. And there could be a worry that lots of organizations are going to throw a whole lot of resources at an AI solution that is actually not going to help their business or their organization in any way. So that's a very quick run through of some kind of myths. But, one thing we're really keen on is that everyone finds out more about AI. We view it as a tool that can be used by humans, and with any tool it can be used for good or for bad. So we feel it's important to empower people with the knowledge to understand the capabilities and limitations of AI technologies. We want to empower people with knowledge and skills and education to constructively and critically contribute to the conversations around AI at the moment. There's 2 exciting online courses coming out in September. One is developed by us. It's called Living with AI. It's a completely free, aimed at the general public online course around what AI is at a high level and how it actually impacts your life. And then the Data Lab, our sister organization, releasing a course that's aimed at senior leadership around driving value from AI at businesses and organizations that are considering going on an AI journey. And that's it. And that's some details about us. I obviously haven't gone into great detail about what we do at the Scottish AI Alliance, nor have I gone into wider issues around inclusion, diversity, and the importance of inclusion and diversity in AI, and getting as broad a range of people involved in the conversations, in the development, in the use, etc. But I think that's for another day. But that's just a very quick overview. And I think now I will hand over to Gina, who will tell you a bit more about ChatGPT and other generative AI.
Thanks, Steph. All right, let me see if I can get my screen share going. Hopefully you're seeing the presentation.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So yeah, my name is Gina Helfrich. I'm the program manager at the Center for Technomoral Futures, which is housed within the Edinburgh Futures Institute at University of Edinburgh. And as John was saying, we are really invested in weaving together technical expertise with other forms of expertise, ethical, moral, social, political expertise, so that we can build solutions to the problems that we're facing and futures where everyone can flourish. So the Center for Technomoral Futures is particularly focused on ethical implications of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and other data-driven technologies. So today, I'm going to talk in a little more detail about ChatGPT in particular, because I know that that is one of the AI technologies that's just been generating a lot of interest. Let's see. So just to explain what ChatGPT is, it is what we call a large language model. So this is a form of AI. The chat part is because it's about language and text. It's a form of what's called natural language processing. Other kinds of natural language processing that you may have run across are like the auto predict when you're typing an email, or autocorrect. Automated plagiarism detection is natural language processing, or if you've ever heard of like sentiment analysis, where it's assessing like whether a block of text seems more positive or more negative, that's also natural language processing. So it's in the same family. That's the chat part. And GPT, you may have wondered what it stands for. GPT stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer. And so we'll just take each one of those in turn. So generative in the sense that it generates outputs, right? Generative AI, for ChatGPT, it generates text, but there are other kinds of generative AI. For example, like Midjourney generates images. So the pre-trained part kind of links back to this large language model is what it is. Essentially, there's large, and I mean very large, amounts of scraped text data that are used to train the model so that it has something to use to identify patterns to inform what the output is going to be. And in the transformer piece, that's really kind of the AI part of ChatGPT. So transformers were only invented in 2017. And the way that it works is that it sort of learns, in quotation marks, context of language by tracking relationships in sequential data, so data that are in order, like words in a sentence, right? Like we read English language left to right. And so that sequential data is the pre-trained part. That's all the data that was scraped from the web, books, Wikipedia, Reddit, all kinds of places that information has come from. And then what it does is it uses all that data to create sort of a symbolic map that will predict how words relate to one another and which words are likely to follow others. Now, as humans, we don't ever have direct access to the map, which is sort of why it's considered like a black box. But it uses the probabilities based on that symbolic map that it's constructed to inform its outputs. So it's not as simple as, well, the word that's most likely to follow, the word before is what it's going to output. It's more sophisticated than that, but in the end, it all boils down to a series of probabilities, which is how it creates its outputs. So there are, I think as Steph was just gesturing towards just now, there are definitely limitations of the performance of ChatGPT for right now. And so to start with, thinking about limitations on the basis of its training. So that's, that huge scrape of essentially internet data that has been used to train it. So first of all, we have to be a little bit vague about that because OpenAI, who are the makers of ChatGPT, are not being open, despite their name, about the exact data that it is trained on. But we have kind of some notion. And that training data, they have been very clear, only goes up to 2021. So it cannot provide any, current information like for this year, for example. So it might provide things that are out of date. It's also the case that there is bias in the training data. So if you just think about a site like Reddit, for example, it's not, a perfectly representative sample of human beings and reflective of what the world is really like. And so you will often encounter bias in texts on the internet. And so because such a huge scrape of data has gone into the training of this thing, it has also ingested all of those biases. And so that will pop up sometimes. And then finally, alongside that huge scrape is definitely, we are very confident that there's also intellectual property that has been included in that training data. And so as you can imagine, there are some real, potential bad consequences of using something that has been trained on someone else's intellectual property. And if you look in the news, there are lots of people who have decided to sue over this. And it's definitely like a very live concept right now. There are other limitations on ChatGPT on the basis of the way it's constructed. So it's not just a problem with its training data, but just sort of like how it's built in itself. So the first thing that I think is really important to remember is that it does not have any notion of truth and falsehood. So, as we just discussed, the way that it's built is by understanding sort of a symbolic map of language, but it doesn't have any reference outside of that map. So it can't understand the real world. And part of that means that it doesn't really have any concept of what's true and what's false. It really just is kind of like playing games with language. And to kind of make matters worse, it is very good at generating plausible sounding but wrong answers. So especially if you are interacting with it on a topic that's outside your own area of expertise, it can provide information to you that might sound like it's correct, but actually is completely false and made up. And again, just making matters worse, it is designed to sound very confident in its answers. So ChatGPT, if you have had any experience with it, it doesn't really hedge its bets very often. It's like, maybe this is the case. It never talks like that. It's always very authoritative. So it will authoritatively tell you something completely wrong. And if you don't know better, then it's very easy to assume that it's correct just because of the way that it kind of constructs its outputs. And unfortunately, it does not learn from its mistakes. So if you correct it, if it gives you something that's wrong and you say, no, actually, that's not right, this other thing is the case, it'll say, oh, I'm really sorry. And then it'll kind of parrot back to you what you've just said, but it doesn't actually like retain that information. And you can kind of, if you see anyone who posts about interactions that they've had with it, sometimes you'll see that they kind of go through a whole back and forth conversation with the tool and then and kind of go like, okay, so let's try this again from the top. And then it will just give the exact same answer that it gave the first time. So in addition to limitations, there are also risks, I think, involved with use of ChatGPT. As I was kind of gesturing towards, there are data protection and intellectual property issues, not only with the fact that the training data includes intellectual property, but also on the other end, anything that you type into that box is being shared with OpenAI, who are the makers of ChatGPT. And so that data could potentially be shared with other users or organizations, and could also be used to train future versions of ChatGPT. So if you put any IP in there, then you will be putting that IP into potentially a future model of ChatGPT, which will essentially have it forever. So there's really some caution, I think, to be exercised on what you decide to actually input into the box. And then secondly, there are some definitely like ethical issues with regards to ChatGPT, and it's not unique to ChatGPT and OpenAI. It's really an issue for practically any generative AI tool that's out there. But there is a lot of human labor that is required to train ChatGPT and other generative AI tools. Most of the time that gets outsourced to developing countries. It's generally poorly compensated. You may have seen there was an article about workers in Kenya who are paid something like $2 an hour for their work. And sometimes it can involve traumatic and really harmful content because unfortunately, there's a lot of horrible stuff on the internet that is part of that huge data scrape that went into training it. And so obviously, like OpenAI doesn't want it to be spitting out horrible things. And so it uses humans to try to teach the machine what not to say. And that means exposing them to the horrible things that it's not supposed to say. So there are a lot of issues around this kind of like labeling and outsourcing of work on making generative AI tools safer for users. And then finally, it's, again, OpenAI is not being super open about the details, but it's definitely clear that there are significant energy costs associated with both the initial training of ChatGPT and then also its ongoing use. So very likely, you know, when you type into the box, like that's contributing to the climate crisis, because I don't think that OpenAI is using all that much clean energy. But it's a little bit obfuscated, like exactly what the implications are, because as I mentioned, they're not being especially open about that information. So all that to say, this is a very new, constantly evolving field. Even the way that a tool like ChatGPT behaves is evolving from month to month as they continue to kind of make tweaks. Things are changing. So we don't have a really well-established best practice right now, but what we do have kind of boils down in my mind to, one, when you're using it, you have to really carefully review the outputs for bias and errors. And then secondly, it seems like there's pretty good consensus that when you have used this in some kind of document, you should declare that you've used it. So you should say, you know, in a footnote or somewhere, ChatGPT was used to generate XYZ. So I will leave it there, and then we can get to the best part, which I think is Q&A.
Thanks very much, Steph and Gina. That's really excellent to get both the overview and the deep dive into ChatGPT there. It's so clear and useful. Questions are starting to come into chat now, and just while people kind of organize their thoughts and put them there. One question I was thinking about, and maybe it's a question to both of you, is this balance between, I think, Steph, your kind of approach there on kind of myth busting and saying there's some stuff you might have read about in the media, you don't actually need to worry about that. And then the other point being, there are things we want to experiment with carefully. And I wondered if you're maybe talking to a board in an organization, how you get that balance right, because you probably want to save the board. Don't worry about the science fiction stuff, but let's carefully explore what is available and its limitations. And if you had any thoughts about maybe queries you had from organizations on that front and how organizations are approaching it.
Well, I think that the important first step of that is understanding what is science fiction and what isn't, because that's not a given. You know, you can't just say, oh, don't worry about that, that's not true, you know, kind of thing. It's just ensuring that everyone kind of is, you know, kind of has a kind of foundational understanding of all these things, because, you know, it can be quite deafening what's out in the media. And we actually stayed quiet for quite a while, you know, with all this stuff. But then it got to the point where we're like, oh my God, we need to put something out, because this is just crazy, because there's no balance to what's out there. It's just all, you know, and you know, it's something I personally am very interested in, like, you know, this kind of dystopia versus utopia kind of thing. You know, the narratives are always the extremes, but the truth is the truth is actually quite boring and in between, but that doesn't sell papers, that's not headlines kind of thing. So I think in terms of a board, it's really getting everyone to really understand, what AI is, what it can and can't do, the limitations, and actually whether it's right for your organization. It can be very easy to be caught up in thinking, oh, great, we're going to use this to write funding applications, or, we're going to do this with it, do that with it, or yeah, we can replace this job function because that can do it, but to go into it blindly could be a massive false economy as to whether it is of any benefit to your organization at all. So I think it's just make sure you kind of you are doing it in an informed way as opposed to following the hype and the kind of narrative that's kind of out there at the moment. Gina, what do you think?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think, I'm completely in alignment with you. I think understanding what the limitations are and what's real and what's science fiction, it is really the priority, because it's if you are not informed otherwise, I think it's really easy to assume that it does know what's true and false, and that it is giving you accurate information, like that it's not going to give you biased answers. Like, I definitely, there is that feeling, like, I don't know if you remember, like the feeling that you had when you first played with like a smartphone, just kind of that like, wow, this is cool. And there was some of that, like the first time that you had a little back and forth with ChatGPT, you're like, wow, this is cool, right? So it's really easy, I think, to get kind of swept up in that. And that's where the danger lies, right? So if you're not aware of what the limitations are, I think it can be easy to just kind of like assume that it's going to work well for any given use case. And so just, I would just reinforce what you're saying. Like, I think getting a grip on like what those limitations and risks are and what's real and what's not is kind of like the first step.
And it's also like around ChatGPT, Gina, do you think that some people misunderstand it to, kind of use it to be a source of truth, like asking it questions, but that's not what it's actually there for. It's kind of like you can't treat it as a source of truth. If you understand what it is and use it to what it can be very good at, then it's actually a really useful tool.
Yeah, someone made this point to me that I just thought was so insightful, which is that, that when OpenAI released ChatGPT initially, like, it was completely unclear whether it's a product or like a research effort, right? So because of that kind of fuzziness, just like you're kind of saying, like, there was never any clarity around what it should be used for. So people could just kind of try anything. And, I think we're still kind of only in the early stages of getting a really good handle on, yeah, use it for this, don't use it for that, right? Like I had someone tell me that they use it for like trip planning. And I sort of felt a little skeptical, but I was like, well, let me try it. My husband wants to go to Isla for his 40th birthday. And so I put, give me like an itinerary for one day in Isla. And, it said, do this and then do that and then do that. And basically like it was way too many things for 24 hours.
Yeah.
It's like it has limitations. Yeah.
One use case in my team is apparently they looked in their fridge and went, well, I have these ingredients, and they put in ChatGPT, I have this in my fridge, what dinner could I possibly make? And then therefore if you then understand that, then it goes and trawls through recipes, with those common ingredients, it'll come out with some suggestions. So I think that's quite a cool way of using it.
Yeah, exactly. Like fridge, yes. Travel planning, maybe not.
Yeah, as opposed to what should I do with my life, kind of.
Good. Great. That's lovely. So we've got some specific questions coming in now. So if it's okay, I'll just pick them up in turn, if that's all right. So Joe Derry Hall has one about Claude 2. So he said he's seen an article about that saying it's got some principles that make it more compatible with human rights, and he wonders if that means it's a more ethical and safer alternative to ChatGPT. So that's a quick yes, no, or maybe question, I guess. I don't know, Steph or Dina, if you wanted to jump on that one?
It's a don't know from me because I've
So
been
don't know.
completely
Okay.
switched off for the last 2 weeks on holiday.
Yeah.
So I haven't actually read that.
I'm not familiar with it, to
Yeah.
be perfectly honest. I think it's healthy to wonder about any claim that a company makes that is invested in turning a profit, especially if they're not providing the transparency that would be required to verify it.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I would come down.
I think that's fair. I guess the problem is at the minute stuff is moving very quickly, so journalists will just report what they're given without a chance to scrutinize it. Did you have any more thoughts on that, Joe, or is that something you're just wondering about yourself?
I'm in the middle of trying to build a tool, and
Okay.
and basically it's well, it's an experimental stage, but we are looking at choices. So I suppose
Okay.
it's probably one of the realities of just it is moving fast. It's like looking for ongoing practical advice would be like super helpful, I think.
Okay, so in a way, is your question about, how do you get a bit more insight or scrutiny if you're using something as part of a service you're building? Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. And kind of like where do you go for good advice, I guess, about technology choices and ethical technology choices?
Okay. Any quick thoughts, Steph and Gina, on approaches there? Or
I think a key bit of advice is always to start from a critical eye.
Yeah.
I'm an internal optimist, but you kind of have to approach all these claims with a pinch of salt, like Gina said. Ultimately, it's cynical, but it's very true to a lot of this stuff. Is that any claims from a company whose ultimate aim is to sell a product has to be, kind of, you need to cast a pretty cynical eye on it. So I think that's a good baseline to start with in terms of where to get the right advice or info. There's a plethora of stuff out there. One of the key things we're trying to build at the Scottish AI Alliance is the Scottish AI Playbook, which is essentially an open collaborative resource on, hopefully a one-stop shop on to find information on AI for anyone about to embark on a journey with AI. It's currently down for maintenance. Brilliant. Like doing this timing, but it should hopefully be live again at the end of the week. And it's actually a wiki because we're asking the wider AI community to work with us to submit really useful resources. So there's all sorts of things around, ethical frameworks and reports and white papers and guidance and guidelines and all there, that we eventually hope to have kind of user pathways. So for example, are you someone who works in the third sector organization? Come look here. So we're going to have informational hubs on the playbook. So the first one we're working on currently is a health and social care. AI and health and social care info hub, and then we are looking at a regulation hub as well, and also a third and voluntary sector info hub as well. So there's all these things in play, but I think the key thing is to ask. There is quite a vibrant AI community in Scotland. Organizations such as the Centre for Technomoral Futures. That Scotland has this incredible academic heritage in AI, and it's a conversation everyone's very willing to have at the moment. So it's ask, approach. The Data Lab have lots of resources as well. Like I said, Scottish AI Alliance, University of Edinburgh have a lot of things, and more kind of representative organizations, member-based organizations are starting to provide more and more resources around this to help their members, their stakeholders, to kind of navigate what is essentially a very complex and potentially very misleading landscape.
Yeah. Okay. Did you want to add anything on that one, Gina? Or okay. I'm going to make a quick plug for SCView. We have our own guide as well, which is just evolving and developing. So we've taken input on that. As people have said, it's a new area, so it's not definitive, but that's there if you need it. I think maybe in your question, Joe, about developing a service, I guess my quick thought would be, if it's low risk, low consequence, it's it's probably fine to experiment and try stuff out. But if you're doing anything which is going out directly for users to interact with, and you want to have a lot of care there about making sure you've got ways of checking and reviewing content, because I think we've all seen the examples of, well, there's a famous one in the US where an eating disorder organization thought it could make use of a chat-based service, and it turned out it was catastrophically wrong. I think it was switched off very quickly, but it was a good example where they hadn't done the kind of upfront work on how are we going to be sure this is going to work safely and appropriately. I want to do a quick, Jen, what did you get your dad for his birthday? Can you tell us that one?
I got him a personalised golf towel.
And was that a surprise? Was that something you would have thought of yourself?
Probably not. No. So I just typed in what do you get for a middle-aged man who likes golf beer, and and it gave suggestions. So having ChatGPT as, I guess, a kind of source of inspiration rather than fact is something that I kind of take that kind of approach to. So it's I also got as Steph and Gina were saying about other kind of uses in personal life as well. I find that I don't think for myself as much anymore.
But that's a really neat example, because you'd have the human in the loop as well. You didn't just say to an AI-based agent, go and buy something and send it without me looking at it. So you had a chance to review it and check. So that's good. Callum's got a question and a follow-up. So your first one was about any use cases. So I guess that's one we can ask the room as well. So maybe if anybody has been trying out generative AI in one way or another, of examples of how they've seen it being used. I'm looking around the room, pop a hand up if you'd like to. It may be that nobody is wanting to jump in with it just now. I think one way we've seen it at SCBO in our own practice has been around, oh, Joe, you got a hand up, go for it.
Just that I've heard of a few people using it for grant writing. So to do like a rough first draft, that kind of, the kind of terror of like the blank page, and it just does like a kind of that first go at it, and then you take over as a human.
Yeah, so people are kind of using it as a starting point. And that's the example we discuss in our AI guide. Actually, we look at ways to kind of manage risks there, because obviously the risk is if you just let generative AI do all the work and didn't check it, you might end up submitting stuff you shouldn't do. So that's one. You got your follow-up, Callum, was about copyright issues. So there's obviously been a lot of backlash there where original content has just been used to derive new stuff, and a question is about whether we think that might get regulated or that it might just be the ship has sailed and we're going to have to live with it.
I think in terms of regulation, it is the big discussion at the moment, and I think there's currently no right answer, because existing rules of regulation isn't fit for purpose for technologies such as AI that move at a pace that normal regulation can't keep up with. So in a way, we kind of need to innovate around regulation itself. But I think, lots of people putting all the eggs in the basket of regulation, but the truth is there are many different, well, not many different ways, but I think, regulations, standards, frameworks and stuff all need to work together in terms of this, but the EU AI Act has had, they paused for a while to factor in the complications of generative AI, and they added like copyright into it. But I think it is a huge can of worms at the moment. I don't think anyone's got the right answer, but those conversations need to continue to be had, because copyright is a massive issue, and it is, it is. I think copyright has always been an issue in terms of technologies, but more so now that there's all these people's livelihoods essentially being used to create someone else's livelihood, and the ethics around that, not just around copyright, is challenging at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a really interesting one, because it looks to me like so much of it is playing out in the courts right now, and that can also take a long time. So it's a little bit of a question mark, like which might be sort of first, like new regulation or decisions, in a court on the basis of the law as it stands right now. But kind of like more to the point, the way that different countries handle copyright is different, right? So it will be really kind of interesting to see how that plays out, like what kind of things are ultimately decided in the UK versus the US, for example. And I don't think it's going to look the same, depending on where the complaint is raised.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So there's a couple more questions in chat, but Jen, you got a hand up. So did you want to come in?
Yeah, it was just on that point of around copyright and where the liability sits. Does it sit with the person who has taken the whatever has been spat out by, whether it's Midjourney or ChatGPT, and just used that, or is it possible to still be inspired by things that have been made being trained on lots of different information, but then using it as a source of inspiration rather than fact, if that makes sense? So yeah, I was just thinking about if it was referenced better, I think that would make a massive difference to show like where these sources were pulled from. And I know that Google's Bard is a bit better at that, actually, because it's based on kind of live search and things like that, so it can actually reference where it's taking that information from, whether that is correct or not. But would the liability sit with the person who's just copied and pasted from ChatGPT without doing the research to see that actually that's just been picked up from somewhere else? Yeah, that's just kind of a kind of thought that's going through my head about how do you have something that's trained without some form of copyright issue, because it's everybody's stuff is out there to view and be inspired by.
Well, I think the question that you're raising about like who's liable are the kind of things that are being worked out in the courts right now. Couple of things. I don't think it's the case that there's no help for it. All you can do is scrape people's intellectual property. I don't think that's the case. While it is the case that the performance that we're seeing is meaningfully linked to the size of the data that goes into the training. For example, I can't vouch for this, but Adobe claims that they have a generative AI tool, all of the training for which they have proper licensing for. So basically, no kind of illegal copyright use in their tool, they claim, right? So yeah, I don't think it's necessary, but what's gonna happen about it is in the course of playing out, and the questions about where the liability sits, I think have not been determined yet.
I think there's quite a lot of separate issues that are compounding into one with this, because there is, the liability with AI technologies in general. If like, it all kicked off with like self-driving cars, right? Like, if they hit someone, who's responsible? So there is that issue. There's data privacy issues, data scraping issues, in terms of these companies just scraping all this data without anyone's permission to train their AI. But then there's the wider issue that's not specific to AI in any way, which is around inspiration, right? Like, so if you write a book but you're an avid reader, that inspiration is going to feed into what you do. So for example, J.K. Rowling, people are like, oh, it's not original thought in there, right? But she put it all together. So in a way, that's her copyright, her intellectual property. And how do you separate that? I think there's a lot of complicated issues in play around the whole copyright element of stuff, that like I said, that I don't think there's any easy answer for it. And Gina's saying, obviously a lot of it's playing out in court right now. And, for a lot of us that I'm not the biggest fans of, having all that data scraped by Google or by OpenAI or whatever, I'll like kick them where it hurts, kind of thing, And, but yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any black and white answer to this. Ultimately, it's untested and it's complicated. I know, which is a cop out, but it is the truth.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think it'd be really interesting to see what this looks like in 5-10 years time, and the kind of etiquette that comes along with it. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. We'll get you back on DigiShift 300, where we've all got avatars and stuff. So I'm going to quickly skip through a couple of questions. Just want to note Laura's flagging, she's used generative AI to help with writer's block and a kind of starting point, but interesting that your final product actually ends up being quite different, but it's a good starting point. Bernadette, she's not got micro video because she's on a device, but she said she often uses generative AI to help with things that would take a lot of manual work, like sequencing dates through a year or ordering or separating out a list of information, which is good. One which has just come in to me in direct message, so name the person, which is about they've been shortlisting job applications, they've been confident they've seen stuff that's been generated by AI and not checked. And I think that for me is a parallel with a funding bid question. And I think the worry is you might use it responsibly to help you with some phrasing or wording, but if you just put in a minimal prompt and then just tick exactly what came out with no checking, that's problematic. And the point that this person made is that's prompted some reflection about, what a recruitment process is going to look like. Because if at the minute, say a recruitment process or a funding bid process relies on looking at a piece of text up front as the early sifting stage, maybe there needs to be other processes in place to help people make good decisions rather than just relying on the quality of what they're seeing and writing at the early stage. So that's a really interesting one. Okay, so another recipe example from Bernadette, thank you. I wondered on that one about, looking at it from the other side. So if you're reviewing applications, be they job application or funding applications, any thoughts, Steph or Gina, on that one? I know it's a very emerging area, but yeah.
Well, I think, if you just get ChatGPT to write those things for you, I think it's been quite well acknowledged that it'll write you something that's decent. It's not great, kind of thing, like essays and stuff will get you a C or something. But the thing is, in recruitment, I like to think that people don't just recruit on the basis of a written application, that it might get you to an interview stage. But then that's when the human in the loop comes into play and kind of, sifts out, oh yeah, that person obviously didn't write that application, and stuff. And same with funders, well, I guess funders don't necessarily perhaps have an interview stage, but maybe it does. I guess I'm not as familiar with that, but big funding applications definitely will have a further stage beyond the initial written application. So I think perhaps there are already things in the process that would hopefully sift out, the minimum effort created by ChatGPT.
Yeah, I think like if someone is using ChatGPT to try to advance, in some kind of process, like a hiring process or a funding process, I think like you just have to remember that, like Steph says, there's going to be a human in the loop. Like at the end of the day, you're going to have to be accountable for whatever you represented through ChatGPT or whatever it said. So if ChatGPT says we're going to do XYZ on this funding grant, you better be able to do XYZ on this funding grant, right? Like, or if you represent yourself in a certain way, then hopefully that's true about yourself in your job interview process, because that's going to come home eventually. So it's sort of like what happens when it does.
Yeah, absolutely. we're getting towards our last 5 minutes now. I wonder if there's any other questions from the room. One other thing I was wondering about was that question of expertise and making judgments, because I think one theme that's run through everything we've been saying, right from Steph's point about all the jobs aren't going to go, because we're still going to need that expertise and critical reflection to use these tools wisely. And I guess that's a thing we're seeing even with kind of simple text, is it's only going to work if you're there reviewing and checking and responding and updating initial drafts that maybe come from generative AI. So I suppose that's a thought to kind of keep in mind, is these tools look very easy to use, but to use them well, you still need to be applying your professional expertise to check the results. Yeah. And okay, Jen's got a good quick one, which is favorite uses of AI. So I think we've had recipes already. Any other ones that people have come up with?
One thing I'm super optimistic around is the use of AI in healthcare. I say, there's huge potential for AI to transform healthcare for the better and make it more equitable for all, and making a much more efficient health service as well. But it's not straightforward, it's not black and white, and obviously it's incredibly high risk. So the need for ethical, trustworthy, inclusive development and use and deployment of AI in healthcare is essential. But it is, for example, radiology is a much cited application of AI in healthcare. Essentially, AI doesn't get tired at the end of a 12-hour shift and stuff, and human error can kick in because we are humans, and AI provides a kind of second opinion that is consistent, and that can help massively, increase the efficiency of diagnosis of kind of any medical imaging kind of analysis process. So on that level, I think AI is exciting and there's a lot of amazing stuff to do, but also to understand that it is hugely high stakes, and therefore the everything we talk about here is amplified in terms of the need for responsible and ethical kind of development of it. On the other end, it's like AI shows you what you want to watch on Netflix, right? Or what you want to listen to on Spotify, or what you might want to buy on Amazon, and you can view those as much lower stakes applications of AI. You watch a bad movie, that's terrible, that's okay, but it's not going to hurt anybody. So I think it's just understanding that there's a spectrum of like applications of AI where all these considerations are at a different level across the spectrum, and it's to understand that there's a no one size fits all kind of solution to everything.
Yeah, totally agree. I think there's some really like potentially and not even potentially actually great uses for AI in things like environmental protection. So you can use, for example, you can use AI to help with poaching of endangered animals, right? It's kind of like predicts where some of that poaching activity is most likely to happen, and then you can use that prediction to inform where you're going to put your limited resources to catch those people, and this kind of thing. I think there's a lot of really like potentially very exciting kind of environmental science related AI applications, and everything. I'm also on board with what Steph said. I think there's a lot of like really cool healthcare stuff that could potentially come out as well. Yeah.
Cool. I just realized we skipped over Ian McGee from Save the Children had a question about what we think about where things might go in the next couple of years. One thing I was thinking about that often comes up in the voluntary sector is using like retrieval based AI tools. So retrieval based is where it doesn't say I'm going to make something up. It says based on a data bank of correct material, I'll go and retrieve the answer from that. So it's a bit like a much easier to use search tool. And I think that could be quite useful in the voluntary sector, where we often have a lot of expertise and information, but we want to give it to people in easy to understand formats. And like quite often a use case in the voluntary sector is you've got somebody in an organization with expertise and insight. They want to help a lot of members of the public, but do that in a kind of efficient way. And I think we all know, as vaguely digital people, putting it all on a website doesn't always solve the problem, because often that can be hard to navigate and hard to make sense of. So retrieval-based AI could be a useful tool for voluntary sector organizations, because you can use parameters and make sure that it's only retrieving correct answers rather than just making up what sounds good. So that's one. Any other quick thoughts? Steph and Gina, I know prediction is probably impossible, but
well, let's say with a hopeful kind of, you know, perspective, I would love to see the productivity gains of AI actually result in increased leisure for people. So we've got, I mean, that's why I say, like, you have to kind of be hopeful about it. You look at other technological advances, like all of the kind of like home technologies of the 50s, washing machine, you know, dishwasher, all this kind of stuff was supposed to like free up people from the drudgery of housework. And it turns out people do like more housework now than they did before the invention of all that stuff. So what I would love is if we could use some of the productivity gains of AI so that, you know, we can all have a 4-day work week or something like that. So it's not just like squeezing ever more out of us all, but actually like we get a bit of a break because we invented this thing that helps do really like drudgery stuff much more quickly. So
great.
Yeah, that's my hope.
Yeah, I'm going to continue that kind of hopeful vein, you know, and be optimistic on it. You know, I think I like to think that in the next 5-10 years, that AI has essentially enabled us to be better humans, you know, and doing what humans are really good at. But at the same time, also, for example, you know, relieving the stresses and strains on the NHS, you know, for example, bringing down waiting times and stuff by automating some of this stuff that is currently, you know, I think the third sector and like the NHS have similar strains in the sense that the pressures of financial and resources, you know, can be relieved by innovations such as AI, but because of those pressures, you don't actually have time to innovate and you know, kind of test and deploy. And I think that's a challenge. But I like to think that, you know, AI could, you know, result in more equitable education for all, you know, across the world. You know, it could help, you know, tackle climate change. It could help reduce our emissions. It could help improve healthcare for all and access to healthcare for all and speed and efficiency of delivery of that healthcare for all and social care of, as well. And yeah, no, I'd like to think it really will transform our lives for the better, but we have a way to go, I think, to make sure that's done for the many as opposed to the few.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for the questions today. Thanks so much to Steph and Gina for sharing their considerable expertise. It's been really wonderful to have that level of insight and chance to ask the questions. I want to just remind us all that connect with the Scottish AI Alliance. So go to the website, see what they're up to, sign up to the Living with AI course and use those networks. We're really lucky to have these networks in Scotland. They're accessible and open, not just for practical stuff, but for the longer term policy stuff as well. So do make those connections. And the last thing I want to do is plug our next call next month at the end of August will be about bringing together device reuse and digital inclusion. So thinking about ways that we can make sure that people get devices and access, but not in ways that harm the environment. So that'd be great. So thanks to everyone. I'll say goodbye for now because some of us probably have to head on to other meetings. And thanks again to our speakers for joining us today.